The summer evening air outside Buckingham Palace was filled with the usual buzz of tourists, cameras flashing, excited whispers blending with the distant hum of London traffic. It was a typical day for Royal Guard James Beckett, standing tall and unflinching in his iconic red uniform and towering bearskin hat, his expression unreadable. He had served in the Royal Guard for over 5 years, mastering the art of stillness, discipline, and absolute composure. But tonight would be different. Among the gathering crowd of tourists, one man stood out. Daniel Harper, a heavily intoxicated visitor in his early 30s, swaying on his feet as he sloppily waved a half-empty beer bottle. His laughter was loud, his behavior erratic, and he seemed fixated on the guards standing before the gates. "Look at them. Blokes don't even blink," Daniel slurred, nudging his equally drunk friend. "What's the point of them? Statues? Ha!" His friend chuckled nervously, but the rest of the crowd was not amused. They were here to witness a symbol of British heritage, not to watch a drunken fool make a spectacle of himself. James, like the other guards, remained perfectly still. His training demanded it. But Daniel wasn't done. He stumbled closer, weaving through the crowd until he was dangerously near the designated boundary line, the invisible threshold tourists knew never to cross. "Oi, mate, you deaf," Daniel called out, stepping so close that the tips of his shoes nearly touched James' polished boots. James didn't react. Daniel grinned maliciously. "I bet I can make you move." A few gasps rippled through the onlookers. Everyone knew messing with the Royal Guard was serious business. They had a reputation for unwavering discipline, standing like unshakable statues even in the face of insults. But they were also trained soldiers, and if provoked, they could act. "Don't do it, mate," someone from the crowd warned. Daniel smirked. "What, you scared?" Then, before anyone could stop him, he threw the beer bottle. It spun through the air, the glass catching the last sliver of golden sunlight before. Crack! It smashed against James' shoulder, beer spraying across his pristine red coat. The crowd gasped in horror. Everyone expected James to remain still, to endure it as part of his duty. After all, Royal Guards were trained not to react to harassment. But James moved. In a single, fluid motion, he broke formation. And what happened next shocked everyone. The moment the glass bottle shattered against James Beckett's shoulder, the entire atmosphere outside Buckingham Palace shifted. What had been a lively, respectful crowd of tourists turned into a stunned silence, eyes locked on the unthinkable sight before them. A royal guard had moved. James, still gripping his rifle tightly, had taken a sharp step forward, his body language shifting from statuesque stillness to controlled action. The air was thick with tension, the weight of centuries-old tradition hanging over the moment. Royal Guards did not react to taunts or insults. It was their sacred duty to remain impassive. But this wasn't a taunt. This was a physical attack. James had spent years honing his discipline, standing immovable in the face of jeers, mockery, even tourists daring to test his resolve. But this was a deliberate act of aggression, and aggression required a response. Daniel Harper, the drunken man who had thrown the bottle, was still laughing, as if it had been a harmless prank. But as James took another purposeful step toward him, the laughter died on his lips. "Blimey, he moved," Daniel muttered, stumbling back a step, suddenly sober enough to realize he'd made a mistake. James' voice when he spoke was low, controlled, and laced with authority. "You have just assaulted a member of the King's Guard on royal grounds." The crowd collectively inhaled, realization dawning on everyone at once. This wasn't just an embarrassment for Daniel. It was a criminal offense. "Oi, mate." "It was just a bit of fun," Daniel stammered, his confidence cracking. His eyes darted around, looking for support, but the crowd had already turned against him. A man in the front row, a middle-aged tourist with an American accent, shook his head. "You just committed a serious crime, buddy. Good luck talking your way out of this one." Daniel swallowed hard, the drunken bravado fading into nervous sweat. James kept his gaze locked on the man, his training ensuring he didn't lose control, even as his adrenaline surged. He knew the protocol for situations like this. Neutralize the threat without unnecessary escalation. The moment Daniel took another step back, James saw his opening. In a single, precise motion, he shifted his stance and swiftly restrained Daniel, gripping his arm in a controlled hold designed to immobilize but not injure. The crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs. James held firm. "You will remain where you are until security arrives." Daniel struggled, but the Royal Guard's grip was unshakable. Within seconds, the palace security team appeared. 2 officers in dark uniforms pushing through the crowd. "Step away, guardsman," one of them ordered, nodding toward James. "We'll take it from here." James released Daniel just as the officers grabbed him, shoving him to the ground and snapping handcuffs around his wrists. "You are under arrest for assaulting a member of the armed forces and disorderly conduct," one of the officers said firmly. "Anything you say may be used against you in court." Daniel sputtered, his face going red. I didn't mean it was just a joke." The officer wasn't amused. "We'll see if His Majesty finds it funny." The crowd broke into murmurs, some pulling out their phones, others still in shock over what they had just witnessed. James took one step back, resuming his stoic posture, rifle in hand, eyes forward. He was once again the immovable guard, as if nothing had happened. But the truth was, something had changed. The tourists knew it. The officers knew it. And soon, so would the world, because within minutes, the footage had gone viral. James Beckett stood at attention once more, his posture as rigid as ever, but he could feel the weight of the moment settling over him. The crowd, still murmuring in disbelief, had their phones out, recording and snapping photos of what had just transpired. A royal guard had broken formation, and not just for any reason, but to restrain a man who had assaulted him. The police officers hauled Daniel Harper to his feet, his wrists now bound by cold steel. His earlier bravado had completely evaporated, replaced with panic and slurred excuses. "I didn't mean it. It was a bloody joke." Daniel sputtered as one officer shoved him toward the police van, his steps clumsy and unsteady. "I didn't know I could get arrested for that." One of the officers, an older man with a weathered face and sharp blue eyes, let out a dry chuckle. "You threw a glass bottle at a member of the King's Guard on royal property," he said flatly. "That's assault, you bloody idiot." The crowd parted as Daniel was dragged through, their expressions ranging from amusement to contempt. "He deserves it," a woman muttered under her breath. "A disgrace," an older gentleman scoffed, shaking his head. A tourist with an American accent turned to his wife. "Do you think they'll let us watch the trial?" James remained silent, standing motionless, his heart pounding beneath his uniform, but his exterior remained calm, unreadable. He had known the moment he moved, the moment he restrained that man, that he had crossed a line no royal guard had dared cross in centuries. Even though he had been justified, even though he had upheld his duty to protect the crown's property, protocol had been broken, and now he would have to face the consequences. The footage goes viral. James hadn't realized how quickly the video spread until hours later, when he was back in the barracks, polishing his rifle in silence. The usual hum of conversation among his fellow guards was absent, replaced by a strange, tense energy. When the barracks sergeant stepped inside, holding his phone aloft, James knew. "You're famous, Beckett." The words carried a mixture of amusement and unease. James simply blinked. "Sir?" The sergeant walked over, setting his phone down on the table so James could see the screen. It was a video, his video. The footage, taken from multiple angles, had already been replayed millions of times across social media platforms. The title read, "Royal Guard Breaks Formation After Drunk Man Attacks. History Made." James watched the familiar events unfold on the screen. The bottle smashing, his step forward, the calculated restraint, the absolute shock on the faces of the bystanders. "BBC's already covering it," the sergeant continued. "The palace's press office is getting hammered with calls." Some think you should be reprimanded. Others, they think you're a bloody hero. James kept his expression neutral, but inside, he was bracing himself. Orders? He asked, his voice level. The sergeant studied him for a moment, then exhaled. They want to see you. James stiffened. Who? The sergeant gave him a long look. The king, summoned to the palace. James had stood in front of dignitaries, generals, and foreign leaders before, but never before the king himself. As he walked through the opulent halls of Buckingham Palace, escorted by a pair of royal household officers, he kept his posture flawless, his face stoic, but inside, his mind was racing. Would he be reprimanded? Discharged? Or, as some in the barracks had whispered, promoted? The doors to the royal audience chamber opened. James stepped inside, standing at rigid attention. The king, dressed in a finely tailored suit, his presence commanding yet approachable, studied James with calm curiosity. I've seen the footage, the king finally said. The world has seen the footage. James remained silent, awaiting his fate. The king's lips quirked slightly. You acted in self-defense, but more importantly, you protected the dignity of this institution. He paused, then added, I believe a royal guard should not be treated as a mere prop for tourists. James' fingers tightened slightly around the edges of his uniform. Was this approval? Some within the establishment believe you should be punished for breaking tradition, the king continued. But tradition must evolve to meet modern challenges. James said nothing. He simply waited. Then the king nodded once. You will not be discharged, he declared. In fact, you are being promoted. James finally blinked. Sir? The king leaned forward, resting his hands on the polished wood of his desk. We are going to change the policies of the Royal Guard. You have demonstrated that our men are more than ceremonial figures, that they can and should be allowed to defend themselves when necessary. James processed this, his training demanding he remain composed, but deep down he felt something stir. History was being made, and he was part of it. Justice served in a new era. Daniel Harper was charged with assaulting a member of the armed forces, disorderly conduct, and destruction of property. His trial was swift, the evidence undeniable. The judge did not take kindly to the disrespect shown toward the king's guard, and Harper was sentenced to a year in prison, along with a hefty fine. Meanwhile, the palace made an official announcement. The rules governing the royal guard were being reformed. Guards would now be permitted to react when physically assaulted without fear of reprimand. Enhanced security measures would be put in place to prevent further attacks. The role of the guard as both a symbol and protector would be reinforced. The public supported the changes overwhelmingly. James Beckett, now Lieutenant Beckett, stood once again before Buckingham Palace, rifle in hand, his stance as steady as ever. But this time, he stood not just as a symbol of tradition, but as a man who changed it.